AskReddit by frog without a cause. What's the most horrific act committed by someone you know personally? NSFW. Worked with a guy who got done for manslaughter. He bashed someone's head in with a table in a pub. This was after he stabbed a guy in the chest with darts. This was over a darts game. He also served time for beating a policeman into a coma with the policeman's own truncheon after the policeman caught him breaking into a car. That whole event sounds oddly British for some reason. A friend I grew up with got a job in a care home for vulnerable children and teens, mostly kids with severe learning difficulties, mental health issues, brain damage, etc. He was in his mid-20s and was caught having sex in the care home with a 14-year-old girl. Not only was she 14, she also had learning difficulties so severe there was no way she would have been able to consent. He raped her. He got 4 years, served about 3. He's out now but no one has seen him since. I assume he moved away to prevent getting his head kicked in. Nasty bastard. He was always a bit weird but no idea he was capable of something like that. 4 years for raping a vulnerable child in his care when people spend half their lives in prison for drugs. Horrible. Not as bad as some of these, but my mom abandoned my siblings with me, 22 at the time, because her boyfriend tried to make a pass on the 12-yo. She went as far as to blame my sibling for being seductive and seducing him into wanting them, at 12. Guy I considered a close personal friend hunted down his ex, shot her with a rifle and then turned the gun on himself. Neighbors reported hearing him say, "You knew this was going to happen." This just goes to show how difficult it is to spot an abuser in the wild. A former co-worker murdered his friend when the friend agreed to work with the police to bring down my co-worker for stealing a shipment of human growth hormone. Apparently it was a vicious murder. They burned the body, but it's been a while. My co-worker ended up being on the run for many years, and was eventually turned in after his story ran on America's Most Wanted. His fiancée saw it, and he confessed who he was to her. She waited until he was asleep and went to a payphone to turn him in. What was he planning on doing with all that growth hormone? Someone I sorta knew from school hid behind his front door, waited for his mother to come home and hit her on the head with an axe when he was around 14. He probably instantly regretted it and called an ambulance. Luckily, she survived and suffered no permanent damage. I think he went to a mental facility after. I had an acquaintance who owned a ironworking shop. Some employee of his thought he was fabulously wealthy because he was well off. The dirtball employee went to their house and tortured 4 of them to death to get their fabulous wealth. $40,000. Unfortunately the housekeeper was there as well and they tortured her too. The junkies ordered pizza and left their DNA to be found. Burned the house. Really very sad. This guy was known to hire guys who had criminal records and give them a second chance. His son was 10 years old. I remember when this case was all over the news. I think the shop owner had 2 older daughters that survived because they were away at school. A girl I went to a small alternative school with and had over to my house for party set her boyfriend up to be murdered. Lured him outside and had him shot. On surveillance she walked up and made sure he was dead. Some cold shit. Deleted. School name so I can avoid ever attending. I only met him once as a kid, but my granddad's brother-in-law. He approached me and my mum in a cafe. I was 8 and tried starting normal conversational small talk. My mum panicked and asked him what the hell he was doing out of prison. He brushed her question off and he knelt down to talk to me, which made my mum pick me up, sling me over her shoulder, and run back to the car. I just remember being so scared by her sudden moves I quietly burst into tears in the car and we drove halfway home. Mum then stopped in a supermarket car park, got in the back, unbuckled me, and we cuddled in the back for what felt like days, most likely an hour tops, whilst we both cried. I had no clue what was happening but mum calmed me down and she kept saying "You're safe. I love you" over and over. I found out years later he slit my granddad's sister, his wife's, throat and brutally beat her to death. Hence my mum's fear. You sound like you have a good mom. Guy I went to school with was real calm, very smart, and everyone loved him. He was a gentle person from what I remember. He had lost his mom a couple years before this. She was a nurse and they found her dead in a hospital room during her shift. Unknown causes. Our senior year of high school. Dude is a championship wrestler, dominating his grades, and just doing good. He lived with his dad who was a police officer for years and years. At lunch one day he left school and came back. Everything was normal and the day was finished out. His dad did not show up for work that evening, and the police sent someone to go knock on his door. They found the house ransacked and his dad lying in bed with a single gunshot wound to the head, deceased. Later that night they called my grandmother in for questioning because she cleaned their house once a week. Not much later than that, the guy I went. What happened to him? My father beat the shit out of my mother and myself when I was a toddler. I have an uneven skull because of it. Until I found out, I thought it was a birth defect. I didn't find this out from my mother until I was an adult when I had to take him to court because he had opened numerous credit cards with my social security number when I was a kid and had tanked my credit by the time I was 18. What a fucking piece of shit. Deleted. Jesus fucking Christ. A guy I knew killed his father in front of his mother and younger brother trying to protect his mum from severe abuse. After he served his sentence, the family accepted him back and they've been living a normal life to this day. That started off really messed up but turned into something completely understandable. Glad they accepted him back. When I was a kid I was in the hospital for some surgery. In the next bed over was a kid who was younger than me in a full body cast. Turns out his dad was drunk and ran over him with the car. But that's not the worst part. His dad, apparently a hopeless alcoholic, later committed suicide. But that's not the worst part. A few years ago, I decided to look for the kid on the internet and see how he was doing. Turns out, he killed his wife with a chainsaw, and then killed himself with a routine to take own life coroner/97,883. But that's not the worst part. Their 14-year-old son found them. That would fuck you up for life. Deciding to die by chainsaw is another level of crazy. Deleted. WTF. Why would someone do that? Just don't have more kids. Two guys I went to school with, one primary school and one high school, kidnapped a woman, raped her, disemboweled her, and cut her throat. She survived and testified. They are both in jail for life. You can read more here. https://allthat'sinteresting.com/Alison-Bota. I know who that is and I will not be reading that again. One of the worst cases I've read. Makes me wanna live a hermit life but I can't grow a beard. When we were in school, this boy from our year, we were 13 years old or so at the time, was with his two older brothers and kidnapped a man. The man was dating their sister and at that time, people were very protective if you dated someone's sister. They took him to a petrol station and covered him in petrol. They then took him to a forest and burned him alive. All three brothers went to prison but since they were minors I don't think they got that many years. When I was 21/22 I bump into the guy from my year in a takeaway. And he tells me he's working at the local supermarket. Few months later I end up working in that same supermarket. And he goes to me, anyone messes with you let me know. I'm thinking now I don't want them dead in a forest. How did the sister feel about all this? If my family did something like that I would never talk to them again. Imagine you're excited to get your first kiss, then find out the dude got burnt alive by your own kin, just for liking you. Disgusting. Deleted. Holy fuck, I'm sorry that happened to you. One of my childhood friends was diagnosed as schizophrenic in his early 20s, went off his meds for a bit of time and had an episode, bludgeoned his mom to death, who was my parents' friend. They found him in a fetal position crying and not understanding what happened. He committed suicide a few years later while in jail. That's so awful for everybody involved. Imagine your brain just suddenly turning on you and becoming your enemy. My mother tried to kill my father when I was a toddler by taping up the windows in our apartment. She turned on the gas at the stove, took me and left. She knew my dad would light a cigarette upon returning home. She was banking on it. Luckily my dad was able to smell the gas leaking under the door. Did she get the idea from The Simpsons? One of the early Sideshow Bob episodes has him attempting almost the same thing. Someone I was close friends with till college was raping his wife's daughters from her first marriage for years. He was also filming it and distributed the material, and was teaching other pedos internet security and how to use the dark web. A laptop involved in a sting in the UK undid all his careful trail covering. The investigation revealed over a decade of traceable data of his activities building a CP criminal network. I don't like to think about it. I thought for sure we knew the same guy until I read the UK. I know a guy who did the same thing to his stepdaughter. It's absolutely disgusting to remember all the times you joked around and had a good time with them. I live down the road from Terry Joe Volner. He rode my bus every day, and was also a violent, horrible person. He murdered a 5-year-old because he had feelings for the kid's mom and I guess she didn't feel the same. So he murdered one of her kids, took a picture of the child's body and sent it to the child's mom and told her he was going to kill her other kids that he was babysitting if she didn't come home right now. He got life. Then he beat his cellmate to death with his bare hands so brutally they considered the death penalty. He got life again. Edit, a word. You know it's going to be real bad when they use the person's full name. My mother attempted suicide in front of me. She called me downstairs to witness her take a bottle of pills and then told me it was my fault. I was 9. Mum survived, but I've never been able to let that go. She still believes she's fine and everyone else is the problem. I have compassion for her, but I can't have her in my life. I'm a 42-year-old mother and I can't fathom doing that. Edit, I'm blown away by all of the upvotes and responses. Each and every single one of you is an inspiration and I want all of the good in the world for each of you. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. My mother came home from 2 weeks in the hospital after a dramatic suicide attempt. She took a bottle of Valium. It wasn't nearly enough to kill her. It takes a lot of benzos kill you, and looked me right in the eye and said, "This is your fault, because you're a bad girl and I hate you." I was 12. You never forget a thing like that. I feel actual physical pain every time I think of her, which is less and less often now that she's dead. I'm as over it as I probably ever will be, but there really is no pain quite like the knowledge that your own mother doesn't even love you. A friend was brutally murdered a few years back. Due to my relationship with him and Amp, having met his assailant a few times, I cooperated with investigators. I was privy to details not released to the press or initial public records. They didn't just stab him to death, he was tortured. Then they took cash advances at his bank's ATMs to go on a drug spree. Drove his beloved Mustang all over, then partied in his house for a few days. The victim was gay and Amp. Their murderer immediately tried to pin his disappearance on a soldier he was seeing. Unfortunately, the stench of decay prompted police to get a search warrant. M. Fair had the receipt in his pocket for the container he'd bought for my friend's body. I still can't walk down a storage solutions aisle. All I can think about is what size beam would accommodate someone my friend's size. Dude had a rap sheet and Amp, a public defender, ended up doing a plea deal, will be locked up for at least a few decades. With good behavior, he should never even hope of seeing the light of day after he butchered someone like an animal, then hung out in the next room like it was nothing. I'm so sorry. I hope for your healing. Guy I knew from Sioux Falls, SD was convicted of many counts of rape on a child. My kids had spent time him. He was a family friend and they called him uncle. I had suspicions and cut off contact. Couple years later, he was arrested and convicted. He was only interested in boys. My son swears this dude didn't touch him. I hope he rots. What made you suspicious? One day while we were in school, an acquaintance's father killed their mother and then himself and set their house on fire. Their father was somewhat abusive, and their mother was thinking of leaving him. It completely changed the acquaintance. He was only 13, but had to basically grow up and mature overnight. He and his siblings had to move in with their grandmother with basically nothing but the clothes on their backs. He was able to get a driver's license at 13 because their grandma couldn't drive, so he could help. Somehow, against all odds, he and his siblings are all perfectly normal people. A cousin had his 2 young children call their mom. They were divorced and it was his weekend with them, to say goodnight. He put them to bed and shot them dead before pulling the gun on himself. I used to work in a preschool and one of the dads did the same thing. He was in divorce proceedings from his much younger wife, and barricaded his doors before setting fire to his flat, killing himself and their 2 little girls. I hate the term extended suicide. The man was scum. I stupidly went and read some of the social media posts he wrote that night, and it was incredibly hate-filled and self-pitying in the worst possible way. Cousin caught by a police sting on a pedophile chat room. Was organizing meeting a woman to abuse her children in front of her. Went to prison, not for long enough. Unfathomable that some people defend him as he didn't do anything yet. My father was caught in a similar sting, but the bastard didn't even get jail time, 2 years probation and 25 years sex offender registration. He died 13 years into the registration period, and my mom and I had quite the celebration when we found out. I knew a guy in the Marines. He was already a shithead, but one day he suddenly got orders back to the US. He was just gone. Turned out that the FBI had been monitoring him trying to groom little girls online and sending nudes. The